Welcome to the city of Hereford, distinguished by its cathedral, the 13th century Mappa Mundi therein, and the very 21st century Royal National College for the Blind. The college offers a wide range of academic, vocational and foundation courses for people aged between 16 and 25. One of the RNC's alumni chairs the college's new Impact programme, designed through IT and other technologies to transform the life chances for the visually impaired. He is also one of our panellists, the former Home Secretary, David Blunkett. And we are in the College Sports Centre, which last year hosted the Blind Football European Championships. I bet that wasn't an option when you were a college student?
No, but we used to kick hell out of each other.
Well, with Baron Blunkett of Brightside and Hillsborough in the city of Sheffield, as he is officially titled, the former Shadow Home Secretary, David Davis, Dr. Kate Hudson, an historian by profession, but better known as the campaigning General Secretary of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, and Quentin, a Herefordshire boy made good, now renowned as one of the sharpest, and maybe the funniest, if sometimes the cruelest, of parliamentary sketch writers for the Daily Mail. But he also has responsibilities, the only responsibility he's ever sought. He is a deputy church warden, which must mean you're a sucker for punishment politically as well.
I'm a very dutiful sidesman, and it's How Capel Church, which is a beautiful church near Ross and Wye. Please visit and donate.
Very good.
Thank you. Our panel.
Very good.
And our first question, please.
Jake Birdsall. Jeremy Hunt has used his nuclear option. What should the BMA do now?
The Health Secretary is going to introduce the junior doctor's new contract, and the BMA is apparently in the throes of deciding what it should indeed do. You observe this, not least in the House of Commons. Quentin,
This seems to be take it or leave it time from Jeremy Hunt. A curious figure, Jeremy Hunt. He's always been quite below the surface, but we're now seeing him becoming a controversial figure. He's done well, I think, so far, to at least keep himself out of the headlines, but this is now changing. Young doctors are obviously vital servants of our society, and they're a very important part of our health service in the future. And it is highly regrettable that they feel ill-used and underpaid. Against that, you have the legitimate desire of the government to introduce a 7-day NHS. This was in the Conservatives' manifesto. And I think that some of us, at least, may have had experience of weekend services from hospitals which haven't been entirely up to scratch. A friend of ours died at Hereford County Hospital at the weekend, and it was very much reckoned that she hadn't been given quite the care she would have got during a weekday.
When you say it was reckoned by, can we just be
it
very
careful? It was reckoned by
careful
friends without any criminal finding or anything like that, but that was what she and her family felt. So there are concerns on both sides, obviously, but there is also, I think, the young doctors have to appreciate that there is continuing economic problems. There is still no money left to echo that Labour note after the 2010 election. And I also feel that the BMA, the British Medical Association, the trade union for the doctors, have become, if you like, the RMT in white coats. They've become very militant. And I am wary of the way that the BMA have been taking their side of the argument forward. And there is an element, the way that some of the most militant workforces now are not our old blue-collar factory workforces. They are now very much in the professions, the lawyers, the teachers and the doctors. They are the people who are cutting up most rough with the government. These are all paradoxes, if you like. My feeling about it is there is going to have to be some sort of compromise on both sides.
David Blunkett.
I ought to declare an interest because my wife Margaret, who's in the audience, is a doctor and was a junior doctor, and reminds me quite rightly that the term junior doctor applies all the way up to consultant. So they're not young, many of them, Quentin. They're widely experienced, and they've been prepared to work weekends, but they frankly had enough. And it's part of a wider demoralisation and demotivation in the health service. I agree with you on one thing. I don't think the BMA have put their case terribly well, But I think that Jeremy Hunt, no wonder you said he kept under the surface. I would have kept under the surface if I'd have been him, because he lacks leadership skills. And that can be best demonstrated this week. Fancy having a letter with a deadline of 3 o'clock on the day of the strike. Fancy saying that the chief execs of Foundation Trust had signed up to it when many of them hadn't. Fancy being belligerent at just the moment when you were offering something extra, because that's what he claims he was doing in terms of the extra pay. Above all, not grasping that unless you trained the extra doctors first, all you do, like a piece of elastic, is stretch it over 7 days rather than 5, not pay people extra for working above those 5 days, therefore making the service as a whole worse over 7 days. I'm totally in favour of a 7-day service in hospitals, although I think there's a very different issue in terms of what's happening in the GP service. 7 day a week in the hospital at the highest level. Get the doctors trained first, then negotiate sensibly, show some leadership, and don't trash the National Health Service.
David Davis.
Well, we shouldn't forget that the starting point on this is the excessive number of unnecessary deaths in the health service, whether it's the weekend deaths, which what this is about, or whether it's mid-staffs or so on. There's a whole series of things that need to be done in the health service to save lives. It's as simple as that. And that's where this comes from. And there were 8 reports into excess deaths in the health service. 6 of them pinned down the problem of staffing at weekends, not just at the junior doctor level, but also at the consultant level. And they're also having a change contract. And that's what, at the end of the day, the NHS is about. It's about patients first. Patients, patients, patients. Now, nuclear option. Well, I hardly think it's a nuclear option. This negotiation has been going on for 4 years. In it, the government has made concession after concession. I mean, even today, even this week, they increased the rate of standard pay, the offer on standard pay, to 13.5%. It involves reducing the maximum number of hours done in a week, reducing the maximum number of hours done in any 7 days, reducing the number of nights that can be done in sequence, reducing the number of long days that can be done in sequence. The exchange for it is it requires junior doctors to work a Saturday as a normal day, not over and above their 40 hours, but as a normal day, as already applies to other emergency services, to police, to health, and so on. So it's a really serious issue, and I think this has been dealt with pretty seriously. And it's been quite easy, or can I say quite normal, to vilify Jeremy Hunt. Now, on this programme before, Mr Dimbleby will tell you I have not hesitated to criticise ministers, including his predecessor as a health minister. But I happen to think that Jeremy Hunt is determinedly trying to do the best possible for the health service. And the response of the BMA has been what it's always been. The BMA trashed Aneurin Bevan. They trashed every single health secretary up until now, including Ken Clarke. They even had a poster campaign against Ken Clarke. If you're as old as me, you can remember. It said, what do you call somebody who doesn't take medical advice? Ken Clarke. Now, frankly, that's not the way to negotiate in an area like this. And I think it's really serious. This is not just a matter of inconvenience. 6,000 cancelled operations has implications for people. They may not die, but they may be in considerable pain. So at the end of the day, I think he's doing the right thing. There may be some further compromise, but doing the right thing in the interests of the patients.
So should the BMA back off now?
Well, the BMA it's not a nuclear option, but it is faced with a fait accompli now, a legal fait accompli. And I think it ought to learn a lesson from this, that, we hear about the doctors being demoralised. Well, let me give you one reason why they're demoralised. In the run-up, last year, in August, they had a calculator for what the offer meant. It was a lie. I'm not picking my words at all uncarefully. It was a lie. It said they were going to lose 30 to 40%. They even debated it within their organisation. Should we continue saying this, although they knew it was wrong? So one lesson for the BMA is, negotiating good faith. Do this properly. Remember, you are dealing with the lives of the nation, and that's what matters above all.
Kate Hudson.
Well, I very much hope that the junior doctors will continue with their brave attempts to defend our National Health Service, and I hope that the BMA will support them. We have to recognise also that there's been increasing popular support for their struggle, and I would like to thank the junior doctors and all NHS staff for the absolutely outstanding work that they do. And they do that in a context where they are facing underfunding, they're facing creeping privatisation. And if we want a genuinely 7-day National Health Service, which I agree that we do, that must come through proper funding and investment in our health service, in staff and in the infrastructure. And we just can't do that on the cheap. If we do it through enforcing longer working hours for the same number of doctors, that is inevitably going to result in damaging to patients and to patient care. So I say good luck to them. It's in all our interests that they succeed.
David Blunkett, just on the question of what the BMA ought to do, should the junior doctors, now that it is imposed, go along with that and accept that that is now the contract that they are obliged to work?
Well, I'm now in a position where I can tell everybody else what to do without having any responsibility whatsoever for it. If I were the leadership of the BMA, I would say to Jeremy Hunt, we accept the principle that you're trying to achieve. We don't believe that it can be managed now. We'd like you to defer the implementation for a given and agreed period of time. In that period of time, you will have brought on stream, Lord help us, it takes 5 years just to get through the basic training, never mind.
Yeah, you said that. You said that.
You asked me what I would say.
I'm asking whether
so,
doctors should comply with the enforced contract. The doctors, the junior doctors.
Well, I honestly don't see how he's going to be able to enforce it. If a doctor refused to sign the new contract, do they sack them? Do they tell them in numbers to go to Australia and Canada instead? It's a disastrous situation that he faces, but it's of his own making. And frankly, it's not the BMA have to get him out of it, it's Jeremy Hunt.
There is a slight air of delusion here, though, with the people on the left saying this has to be paid for. How do you pay for it? The economy is still in terrible trouble, and some junior doctors, the top of the junior doctors, are getting £47,000 a year. So there is an element of reality needs to come into the economics of this.
Thank you. I'm going to go back to our questioner. You are a medical doctor, I presume?
I am.
Dr. Birdsall?
I'm a consultant at the local hospital, yes.
What should the BMA do now, in your view?
I think they've been forced into a corner. I think it is a nuclear option. They have been left now with no other choice but to retaliate in ever-escalating ways.
And will people, like, when you say they've got no choice, do you believe that you and your fellow consultants, who are also, David Davis mentioned, in the throes of negotiating a new contract, you will support the junior doctors if they take even stronger measures than have hitherto been taken?
I've yet to meet a consultant or any other doctor who doesn't fully support the junior doctors.
Thank you very much. Any answers on this or any of the other issues that we're discussing may well be for you. 03700 100 444 is the number. any.answers@bbc.co.uk is the email address. And you can tweet #BBCAQ. Anita Anand will be there to respond to your calls. Our next, please.
Clive Hamilton. If we leave the European Union, will we see migrant camps on the White Cliffs of Dover?
This refers to David Cameron's warning that this is what might happen when the 2003 treaty is not within the context of Britain being within the European Union. David Davis.
Well, the simple answer is no. I mean, what that allegation showed, I'm afraid, is that the Prime Minister is panicking over this, over the state of his negotiation, ongoing negotiation, and the response of the country to it. The simple way to get control of our own borders back is to leave the EU. And so this is absolutely the opposite of what will happen. You know? Now, whatever the arguments on Brexit, as it's called, one thing that can't happen is anybody can enforce us taking in migrants we don't wish to have. What will actually happen, I suspect, in that event, is that the government of the day will decide what its migration policy should be, who it wants to come here, and allow those people in, and nobody else. Full stop.
David Blunkett, you were the Secretary of State at the time signing that agreement, is that correct?
Yes, I negotiated the agreement with Nicolas Sarkozy, who was then the Interior Minister in France. And of course it was a bilateral agreement because it didn't affect the European Union as a whole or its broader borders. But there was no question in my mind that we were doing it as part of a family within the European Union. I'm a European skeptic, but I'm very strongly in favour of us staying in Europe and fighting our corner. Just for a minute, let's examine what David said, which, I mean, it's bizarre that I'm defending the Prime Minister and he's attacking him, but, you know, that's the way politics...
Some things never change,
no,
David.
No. That's the way the cookie crumbles. What we were trying to do and what we achieved was actually to move the border from Kent, from Dover, to northern France. And there was no question in my mind that that would not have been possible were we not part of the European Union. Why should it be? Just imagine for a minute, just in a flight of fantasy, just imagine that the French had their immigration and security staff on British soil at Dover, and there was a flood. Let's just take it as a vivid imagination that the SNP had been in power for 25 years in Scotland and people were being driven out and they were seeking asylum in France and the French were pleading with us not to let them out and we were going to stand there and forbid them to go into another country, because that's what's actually happened. We've not got the 1 million people that Germany have taken, the 175,000 that Sweden, a country 10th our size, have taken, because we have our border controls on French territory. If we didn't, then the border would be England, and the border would then be breached because the moment anyone could get here, they would have under international law the right to claim asylum. So let's get real, get out of the European Union, and you jigger it completely in terms of being able to do those deals and keep those border controls in France.
So in your view, David Cameron is absolutely
right. And it's not scare tactics to tell the truth about the reality of political decision-making.
Kate Hudson.
Well, I'm very much in favour of Britain staying in the European Union, not particularly because I think that everything about it is good. I mean, one could level a huge number of criticisms at it, not least the kind of economic policies, the cuts policies, anti-government spending policies that have been with us since we all signed up to Maastricht Treaty in the early 1990s. But I think for the Prime Minister to use kind of anti-immigrant rhetoric scaremongering to ensure that we stay in, I think that that's absolutely the wrong thing. And I think that one of the best things about membership of the European Union and the European Union itself is the free movement of people. And we shouldn't forget that 1.8 million British people live in Europe, have all the advantages of living across Europe, not to mention our young people who go there as students. So let's have the debate out fully, but let's not have scaremongering about these kind of very serious issues.
I just want to go back very briefly to you, David Davis, because that's what you said about Maastricht has stirred a memory. Am I right, does my memory serve me right, that you were one of the, as it were, unofficial whips for the rebels against the Maastricht Treaty way back in '92?
Regrettably not. I was actually the whip in favour of the Maastricht Treaty.
You were in favour?
Absolutely. But it doesn't actually have that much relevance here. But I want to come back on something, David.
But so it was a good thing, the Maastricht Treaty?
No. When the Prime Minister asked me to take it through, I did it because his government would have fallen otherwise. And we would then have had a...
So loyalty overcame you to your party?
No. There's a rationality to this, I'm afraid, David, as well, sadly. And it's this, that had the government fallen, the Labour government of the day was in favour of the euro and the social chapter, and we would have joined the euro, and that wouldn't have been a very clever outcome.
Quentin, let's.
I should just tell listeners listening in black and white that David Davis went very pink when he admitted that he was government whip for Maastricht. I disagree with David Blunkett over this because the French government did come out and say, actually, we will allow that camp to go on in Calais. I find that the way that Downing Street is conducting this stay in Europe, you jolly well will stay in Europe campaign, so far, I find it unedifying. I find this talk about a reshuffle disgraceful, cynical, discreditable stuff. This is plainly been done to try to scare ministers into supporting David Cameron. I find some of the possible bribes that are going on to being given to former Eurosceptics to change their minds also pretty greasy. There's this terrible sort of Project Fear that's going on. I mean, you now expect Downing Street announcements to be preceded by Alfred Hitchcock film music. And the one thing, though, that really intrigues me about the whole European question is what is Boris going to do? And this is the question that we are all considering. And, of course, the great thing about Boris, ladies and gentlemen, particularly ladies, is that he is very wary of commitment. And so we are all watching it with interest. But, dear Edith, I just don't believe a word that David Cameron is telling me at the moment about Europe.
Oh, dear.
David Davis, and then last word to David Blunkett.
Well, I was briefly just going to come back on David Blunkett's wonderful fantasy of a 25-year SNP driving everybody out of Scotland. The simple truth here is that most of the people in Sangatte have already crossed France, of course, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and any number of other countries to get there. And the rule on asylum is it's the first safe country you get to that is supposed to provide you with the support. So we have a perfect legal reasoning to deal with that, which is why the French Interior Minister said what he said. He basically said we would have to be mad from the French point of view to do this, and they wouldn't do that. But we're also going to say, as Quentin said, we're going to see more of this. We're going to see scare stories on security, on jobs, on immigration we've had, on money, the euro, EU, stability, and so on. And frankly, it's a very sad fact when we are making the most important decision for a generation that we don't see yet proper engagement on the real issues, the real future of our country, which is one which matters not just to us, but to all our children and grandchildren.
David Blunkett, specifically first on the Calais, White Dover question, and then if you want to, slightly more broadly.
Well, firstly, why are people actually collecting in what is called the jungle and in terrible conditions? Because they want to come here. The moment that it's easier for them to come here because there isn't border controls in France, the more people will clearly come. On the point that David Davis has raised, Jonathan, I think this is really important. We cannot say to Greece and Italy, because people have arrived on your soil first, you have to take them. I mean, the Germans aren't saying that. The Swedes aren't taking that. What we need is, well, actually, it's an international, it's a UN, not just a European issue. We need a global understanding of what's happening from the terrible conflict in Syria and a joint approach from those nations that have the wealth to do so to enable people to live in reasonable conditions and to be able to sustain them until it's possible for them to go back to their country.
Among the broadcastable tweets, there's one from Caroline Malloy, who says, the one thing that intrigues the British public is, what is Boris? We'll go to our next, please.
Andrew Keir, how have secret groups on Facebook escaped notice until now if we are over-surveilled?
This is a BBC investigation that appears to have discovered that there are a number of secret groups run by men allegedly with a sexual interest in children, one of them apparently administered by a convicted paedophile, and it mentions one or two names of these secret groups, and it suggests, the BBC investigation suggests, that the images they use are of a pornographic nature and may be images of children. So, to what extent does this, David Blunkett, mean or suggest that we are over-surveyed, as of course the critics of the Investigatory Powers Bill believe that Britain is?
Well, firstly, if this story stands up, then the question for the National Crime Agency, which took over the previous child exploitation unit from the Metropolitan Police, is why weren't you on top of it? Did you not have the powers and resources to be able to find out what was going on if the BBC could do so? So those questions will clearly have to be answered. The broader question that you're raising on the back of two major reports this week, the Intelligence and Security Committee and the joint committee of the two Houses of Parliament set up specifically to look at the new draft bill on investigatory powers. David Davis and I have clashed on this many times, although actually we do agree on the fundamentals that this should only be available, the kind of powers that are in the bill should only be available on a focused and intelligence-based basis rather than just fishing expeditions. We do need very clear parameters. The bill, by the way, is renewing some powers that had fallen. It's actually incorporating in law things that were already going on but hadn't actually been fully approved. And it's renewing some things that the courts had ruled out. So there's quite a lot in this. In the end, I mean, I've just got to say this, in the end, the responsibility of government is to protect us both from international terrorists, from organised criminals and from paedophiles. And in one breath, we want the government to do so. And in the next breath, we're terrified in case that on our behalf, they may overstep the line. And getting that balance right is part of being a really living democracy. When I was dealing with this, Jonathan, as Home Secretary, it included Justice as well at the time, one of the greatest challenges was to listen to people who you didn't necessarily agree with. And quite often, we got it right, or we certainly got it better, because actually, in our democracy, people were listening and debating. And that's what we've got to do for the new bill.
Thank you. Quentin Letts.
I'm unsighted on this issue, but I'll just make three very quick points. One is, how have they escaped notice so far? My feeling is that the internet is as wide as God's oceans. So finding these people must be difficult. Second thing I'd say is, I have an English skepticism of authority, and yet I have a residual trust in society. And that's the balance here, I think, is between those two feelings. And the third thing is, when we have these stories come out, they come out so often, my goodness. And we're hearing in the news bulletins earlier, the terrible story earlier about Levi Belfield, that dreadful man. There seems to be a pederast under every stone. You get that impression. I find that incredibly depressing, but I do think that we, the British, are better than that, and we mustn't be demoralised by these stories.
Do you have a view about the Investigatory Powers Bill, which is for so long going through the House, and whether or not the bulk collection of data, which we'll hear, I'm sure, David Davis talking about, is too great a trawl, or whether, as David Blunkett says, these kind of powers with one or two constraints are vital if we are to protect ourselves from...
With a certain hesitation, I incline towards the Blunkett view on this, in that I do still have enough trust. It's declining, but enough trust in authority to feel that the government is doing its best on this.
Kate Hudson.
I noticed when it was on the news just before the programme started that Facebook had said, we have a well-established process to deal with this kind of thing. Well, it seems to me it may be well-established, but it's hardly effective. And I think that there has to be much greater scrutiny and far better processes put in place, because children in particular must be protected. And there are so many cases now where children are either coming under attack from paedophiles or whatever, or there's kind of bullying things going on where children aren't being sufficiently protected. So I think there has to be a huge amount more work done in defence of that sort of thing. But I think on the wider issue of the bill, I think it's also good to see how the parliamentary committees have really taken it apart and looked at it and aren't going to let it go forward in that kind of condition, because the case for public surveillance powers on that scale just hasn't been made. and it has to be looked at properly.
So you don't buy anything of what David Blunkett said about that?
Well, I think it's a question, at the end of the day, it's a question of getting a balance between the two things. You know, there has to be a situation where people can be protected, children can be protected, but it cannot be at the expense of human rights.
Thank you. David Davis, does that case that we've just been discussing suggest that the surveillance powers are potentially too great?
It sort of, well, let me come back to that, because I think the first thing to understand, I mean, the audience would not have read the Investigatory Powers Bill. It's 296 pages long. It might have been written by Lewis Carroll. It's full of madnesses. I just wrote down a phrase I read. It said, one of the definitions is data includes information which is not data. And when the Home Secretary was asked about this in committee, whether it's a typographical error, she said, no, it wasn't. And when she was asked to explain what it meant, no, she couldn't. So the ministers don't even know what they're doing.
She can ring in if she wants to any answers.
Absolutely. She's never provided me with an answer yet on this subject, so I look forward to it. But the first thing to say about this huge bill, and it's actually 3 reports come out, David, there's also a Technology Committee report, is that, bluntly, it demonstrates in terms that what Edward Snowden said was absolutely accurate. All of the things they have put in place in this bill are putting in law things that he asserted were going on and nobody knew about before. So that's the first thing to say. Now, to come back to the issue of whether the surveillance is excessive or not. One of the problems with excessive surveillance is it's self-defeating. You have a bigger and bigger and bigger haystack for one needle. And the bigger the haystack, the harder it is to find the needle. And it's not just this case. It's 9/11. The Americans had some of the data on the killers, the bombers, or the suicide bombers of 9/11, but they didn't handle it properly, and that's why the CIA head got fired afterwards. 7/7. We had some data on some of the people involved in the 7/7 bombing, and it wasn't handled properly. We didn't press it very hard because we didn't want to give the terrorists a sort of propaganda victory to go with their other activities. But it was clear that that failed too, and there have been a number of times in the handling of this data, the collection of all this data, that it's just proven enormous. It's so enormous, nobody can screen through all of it.
Why should the citizen fear the collection of bulk data if it's merely accumulating, as it were, I put merely in inverted commas, your communications, the websites you have visited?
That brings me right to the issue that the 3 committees commented on. Now, one of them is the Science and Technology Committee, hasn't got a history here, but the other 2 committees, one was set up by the government with a lot of very loyal government supporters on it. I volunteered to the whip that I go on, and I couldn't be sure whether he was going to faint or wet himself. But, you know, there was clearly not going to put me on it. So it's a committee of people who are very supportive of the government. They came out with huge criticisms of this bill. The Intelligence Security Committee, traditionally been very, very, very supportive of the intelligence agencies, now chaired by the ex-Attorney General, was furiously critical of it. I mean, it said, you know, that it didn't address privacy properly, it left that out completely, that it hadn't made the case for the collection, that there was, and so on and so on. I don't want to go on all night about it, but the simple truth is that, you know, this bill is badly drafted, badly put together, and is a cobbling together of basically 66 other acts of parliament and statutory mechanisms under which too much collection is done. We need targeted collection. This is the point David made about our skirmishes when he was Home Secretary. And one of the things I think we did agree on is that targeted collection is much, much more effective than all this bulk collection. When we
leaving aside, you said about effectiveness, that's obviously a practical issue. Sure. But many people who will accept that privacy is important and security is important may be torn. And you believe that they should be, is it that they have rights to privacy, or that their privacy might be invaded that concerns you?
Well, they have rights. There are 2 things. I mean, firstly, the tension, the so-called tension between privacy on the one hand and security on the other is sometimes a simplification. Sometimes it's not better for security that you collect more data because that's more confusing, but it's also an intrusion on your privacy. Sometimes there is a tension. Privacy is a right. It's a right we don't treat properly, and certainly the agencies historically have always taken the view that so long as they don't misuse it and we trust them and so on, it's okay. I'm afraid I don't go that far.
David Blunkett.
Very quickly, yes, we did agree that targeted was better than fishing expeditions. The two main committees this week, leave aside the Technology Committee, actually said that they believed this bill was necessary, that in principle it was right, but it was riddled with contradictions. And I've read the reports like you. I'm afraid, obviously, the audience, both in the hall and on the radio, are at a disadvantage here. They had some very trenchant comments, and I hope that the Home Secretary will take them on board. But we've moved from an era where people had party line telephones, where the telephonist in the local station used to listen to your calls, where, honestly, the post office steamed open at the request of the police and security services your envelopes. We've moved into a massive technological era, and the security services need to have powers commensurate with the power and the evil that they're facing in that era of new communication across the world.
David, just one question to you, really. I mean, one of the problems we had when we were skirmishing across the chamber was a sort of expectation, really, that we could prevent these things before they happened. Historically, our crimes, we catch the criminal afterwards. And sometimes I think we are setting ourselves a standard which is simply impossible to achieve in trying to be able to prevent everything. These people got through the net, 7/7 got through the net, 9/11 got through the net, despite massive amounts of surveillance. Well, sometimes it's impossible.
It is true that we can't do it 100%, but not to try would be a total dereliction of duty.
Thank you. We must leave it there. Again on that, a reminder of the Any Answers number 03 700 100 444. We go swiftly to our next, please.
Elizabeth Burns. Does the UK need a nuclear deterrent?
Does the UK need a nuclear deterrent? Kate Hudson.
Thank you, that's my question.
And theirs.
I think we're in a situation now where Britain has a huge opportunity to change its nuclear weapons possession and all that means in terms of its role in the world, public expenditure, how we see ourselves and what our priorities are as a country. People will probably know that sometime this year, probably later this year now than it was expected last week, Parliament will decide on whether or not the Trident nuclear weapons system is replaced. And of course, there are many, many fine legal and moral arguments against nuclear weapons possession, all of which I support and subscribe to. I think most people today will want to know the answer to the question, does it actually make us safe or not? Is it in the interests of our security? And I would like to point you to something that the Defence Secretary, Philip Hammond, said just a few days ago when he was commenting on the North Korean missile launch. And he said, North Korea seem to think possessing a nuclear weapon makes them safe. In fact, it's the opposite. Having a nuclear weapon makes them a target. And the same thing, exactly the same thing, applies to us. And also, while I'm praising the government, I'd like to point to their national security strategy, which they produced towards the end of last year. And in that document, they identify the main security threats that we face as a country today in the 21st century. And it is climate change, terrorism, pandemics, cyber warfare, all the things that we recognise today as real threats. And state-on-state nuclear threat is actually downgraded to a Tier 2 threat. But in an extraordinary piece of unjoined-up political and strategic thinking, they actually maintain the commitment to spending perhaps as much as £183 billion on a Cold War nuclear weapons system which can never be used. And you mentioned this word, deterrence. Well, as far as I can see, basing our national security on a will they, won't they, press the button game of bluff is just absolutely crazy.
David Davis.
Sometimes crazy what war is, of course, or avoiding war. The first thing to say is the circumstance which led to the creation of Trident and its predecessors were, of course, very different from now. There was a Soviet threat. And I think it's a perfectly reasonable question to say, is it still applicable now? But, as Kate said, the North Korean Republic has been testing weapons and persuading us at least, or trying to persuade us it's got a nuclear weapon. Other nations are on the brink of it. I mean, Pakistan is one, and Pakistan spread the nuclear technology around. So I'm afraid I think it's still necessary. I would hate to find myself in a world where we had no nuclear deterrent, and many of these slightly crazy countries do. I don't want to leave the British public at the risk of their madness in this mad world.
Do you believe that North Korea's potential, or alleged potential sometime down the road, is of such a character that Britain's possession, in the absence of other countries having weapons like Germany, would offer enough protection to prevent them, were they so mad-minded as to fire a nuclear weapon?
Yes, I think because dictators may be mad in many respects, but they don't normally want to commit suicide. And
would it be committing suicide?
Yes,
do you think Britain would retaliate when South Korea would be the principal sufferer as a consequence?
Well, depending who was the target. And I think the problem about this is that there's this huge sort of mathematical logic around all of the deterrent strategies. But we're not just talking North Korea. We're talking a series of other potential enemies. And we can't speak for Germany. We are where we are. We are a nuclear power, and we have the nuclear weapon. I would actually only go for 3 boats. I wouldn't spend more on it than we absolutely need to, because I would actually spend more on ordinary military expenditure, Army, Navy and Air Force. Which may get used at any point in time. But I think when it comes down to it, if there are people, as it were, on the international street with these fierce weapons, we have to make sure they never use them against our people or our forces anywhere.
David Blunkett, on this issue, you find yourself, I suspect, more in tune with David Davis than with your party leader.
Well, I've not pronounced on this since the leadership election back in September, and I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint you. You see, I'm not a Corbynista, but I do think that there's a very good intellectual and practical case for a thoroughgoing review, not simply, and you debated this last week, Jonathan, of whether we should take on and renew Trident, but the whole expenditure on the nature of defence in the 21st century. I, like David Davis, would like to see more spent on those aspects of defence which are practical and usable in the present climate, including, I have to say, as Kate said, on cyber warfare, which will be a major challenge for us in future.
Can you therefore imagine yourself endorsing a view, were it to be that there should not be a replacement for the existing Trident system?
I can imagine if it was undertaken after a thoroughgoing review that intelligently looked at the years ahead as opposed to what we need immediately now, because there's no suggestion that we should simply do away with what we've got. It's now 2032 for the renewal for the new weapon system to be on board. We've got time to do it, and I'm sorry that the Labour Party's thoroughgoing review is not being led independently so that people would have real understanding and it would have credibility when the parties finish that review.
Given that constraint, and very briefly, you seem to be saying that you could imagine circumstances in which you would support the argument against the replacement.
Yes, I can, and I could back in 1986. And that doesn't mean I don't understand the very, very good colleagues and the anger they feel about the way this situation's been handled. We need statecraft now, and we need to look to the future with confidence, but we need to broaden that debate, and it certainly shouldn't be in the hands of those who have already made up their minds.
Quentin, let's.
Since the age of 5 or 6, I've had recurring nightmares about a Neville Shute-style scenario of a nuclear apocalypse. I don't have it so often these days, but it was certainly a big thing in my childhood. There is something satanic and hellish about the idea of nuclear apocalypse. I don't envy MPs this judgment. The whole point of these deterrent missiles is that they will never be used, and let's hope they certainly never are. I will just end, I've been told to be short.
No, you've got another whole minute if you want.
I would also then add two other points. One, we have to be realistic about the threat that we have from Putin's Russia and North Korea. Not so much a threat of actual warfare, I think, but it's a geopolitical threat. But the one thing I could do with that, I really must tell you, is politicians using these weapons to further their own image. And there was a photograph of George Osborne, I think, back in the autumn when he was having a high point and he's fancying his chances to be Prime Minister. And a picture of George Osborne posing at Faslane nuclear base. There was something deeply lowering about a politician using these instruments of mass destruction for a photo opportunity.
The Chancellor, along with the Home Secretary, can also ring into any answers. The number 03700 100 444. Next week, we are going to be in Wolfson College in Cambridge with the Shadow Defence Secretary, Emily Thornberry, with John Mills, who's a co-chair of Vote Leave, sometimes at odds with some parts of his party, Cabinet Minister Matthew Hancock, and Claire Fox, the Director of the Institute for Ideas. Join us there from the Royal National College for the Blind. Goodbye.